"No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook," said the bride. The rancher's response changed her life. Wyoming Territory, December 1879. Dusty Hollow held its breath beneath a white sky, fences half buried, the church bell frozen. At the edge of town, Clara Hensley stirred venison stew, the lid ticking with each bubble. 27, she moved with the hush of someone who had learned to be small when rooms turned cruel. Sage and onion rose with the steam. She tasted, nodded, and told herself that flavor can steady a heart when words fail. 3 hard knocks split the hush. No one called at night, not in weather that erased footprints while a man still stood in them. She unbarred the door. A tall stranger filled the threshold, coat filmed with snow, brim glittering frost. His face stayed shadowed, but his eyes were mountain clear. Clara Hensley, her name in his mouth struck like a match. She gripped the door. "I was told you cook better than most folks pray," he said, "and that you never waste a thing." Heat climbed her neck. The old defense leapt out before she could swallow it. "No one marries a fat girl, sir," she said, breath unsteady, "but I can cook." The wind worried the eaves. He didn't flinch, Instead he reached inside his coat and set an oilskin parcel on her table, careful as a man returning something holy. "Someone trusted me to find you," he said. "For her, said you'd know what to do when you smelled what's inside." Clara stared at the parcel. A faint sweetness crept through the seams, honey maybe or memory. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, boots thudded, steam lifted like a prayer. He removed his hat and opened his mouth with an answer that would bend the course of everything she knew. What he said next would change her life forever. Elias Thornton arrived with snow on his hat, and a clear purpose. A rancher from Thornton's Reach, needing a cook for 20 hands after the last one quit. Clara Hensley listened, palms damp beneath her shawl, and said she would try if he accepted honest effort. He studied her with calm attention, nodded once, and returned before dawn with a creaking wagon. She locked her cabin, tucked the key into her bodice, and climbed up with a box of pans, knives, flour, spices, and a jar of honey. They rattled through Dusty Hollow past shuttered windows and white banks. Elias watched the trail while Clara sat straight, pretending the town's narrow voices lived behind her. When wind sliced the flats, he shifted his shoulder to shield her, a quiet courtesy that mattered more than talk. Miles unrolled beneath a pewter sky. At a frozen creek, he guided the team through a notch between bluffs. "Westline," he said. "From here the land thinks for itself." She almost answered that kitchens do too, yet silence felt safer. Outbuildings appeared near noon, roofs curtained with icicles. Corrals churned white. Elias steered toward a long low structure with a narrow porch. "Cookhouse," he said. 3 hands sauntered over, collars up, hats low, one freckled with broken teeth, whistle. "Thornton, you hired a whole pantry." Laughter barked. Another added, "Reckon we won't go hungry with a cook who already sampled the stock." Heat climbed Clara's cheeks. She kept her gaze level and said nothing. "Unload," Elias said, and they drifted away, snickering. Inside, the cookhouse felt like a cold grave. Soot smeared the walls, webs sagged over a dim pane. The stove sat dead. Clara set her box on the table and stilled her hands. 20 men, 3 meals daily, coffee without end. She had cooked for funerals and harvest evenings, never for crowds, yet hunger followed the same rules everywhere. Elias carried in wood, stacked it by the stove and checked the flue. "Draws poor," he said. "Chimney needs scrape. If smoke backs up, use the back door and I'll pull the pipe." Nothing in his tone hinted at doubt. That steadiness cooled the tremor in her chest. She rolled her sleeves and began. She swept the hearth, shook dust from the grate, and crumpled tinder. Sparks leapt, died, then caught. A thin flame worried the kindling until low breathing told her the fire would hold. Warmth touched her shins, and tears surprised her. She wiped them away and let out a small laugh. From her box she lifted a skillet, 2 knives, sage, soda, yeast cakes, and a spoon smoothed by years. She set honey on the sill to catch wan light. Elias leaned in the doorway, posture easy, attention exact. "Hands eat at first bell, second bell and last light," he said. "Stomachs are loud, tempers louder. Tell me what you need. I'll get it, she said. Flour by weight. Beans sorted. Coffee plenty. Clean salt. Onions. Good fat. Men crowded the threshold. Some stared with dull curiosity. Others sought sport. Clara scrubbed the table with hot water, cut onions and set bones to simmer. She mapped the room, stove, table, shelves, the path between door and barrel, a dip near the coal scuttle. Her mind steadied as the kitchen began to answer back. Elias introduced her without ceremony. Clara Hensley, a tall narrow man with a jaw scar, said, "Hope you can sling more than stew." She replied, "Hope you can fix more than fences, because that door groans like a dying bull." The scarred man tipped his hat. The freckled one smirked until Elias said, "Cal wood detail till spring." The smirk faded. Afternoons stretched while she inventoried supplies. Middling flour, barrels of beans, a crate of turnips, salt pork, more salt than meat, and a side of beef in the cold lean-to. She measured how far she could push each item without cheating on nutrition. 20 men meant mountains of bread and rivers of coffee. She started a sponge, crumbled yeast into warm water, and coaxed it with a pinch of sugar. Cornbread batter rested with sage dried last summer. She rubbed fat into flour for crusts and dropped peppercorns into the pot like black hay. Dusk leaked through dirty panes. The first bell clanged. Elias shouldered a keg while two boys hauled kindling. Clara lifted a lid and tasted. The door opened. Cold flowed in with voices and boots. Men took benches, elbows out, appetite already arguing with man. She lined mugs, poured coffee until the pot sighed hollow, and sent a boy for water. Plates went out heavy, came back slick, then reached forward again. No one thanked her. She watched who avoided onions, who swallowed too fast, who winced at crust. One rider rubbed his chest with each swallow. She noted to cut his portions smaller and thin his next bowl. Jeers still sparked, small jokes about her size muttered between sips. Yet the room changed grain by grain. Stock grew rich, bread rose, the stove steadied, and a hush fell unrelated to fear. Elias ate last, and measured more than flavor with each quiet bite. When the freckled man started again, Elias lifted his gaze and said, "Enough." Clara gathered tinware, stacked pans and wiped spills, movements precise. Now that the rush had broken, Elias said, "You set a strong table." She answered, "It will hold if the weather does." He nodded and took the heaviest pot. Their hands brushed at the base. Heat leapt up her arm like a spark from green wood. She stepped back and busied herself with the bread knife. Night fell hard. The cookhouse turned almost warm. She leaned against the counter and let the tremor in her fingers fade. Fear of failure still gnawed. 20 months tomorrow, then the next day, then the next. Every meal was a test. She could not afford to botch, yet beneath that fear waited stubborn hope. Elias dried his hands and set the towel neatly over a chair. "If any man treats you poorly, tell me. Work is hard enough without fools." His voice held no threat, only fact. She believed him, though she knew men could be decent under a boss and cruel when backs were turned. That truth lived beside another. She had come to make food and a place, and she would do both. He put on his hat, paused and said, "You'll want better flour and more coffee. I'll send a sled at first light." "I'm glad you came." He left before she could answer. Clara banked the fire, covered the sponge and tied a scarf over her hair. Alone with the slow tick of cooling iron, she let herself feel the bruise of each jeer, then pressed a palm to the ache and breathed until it eased. Snow whispered at the window, a horse blew and stamped. She looked over the scrubbed room, the neat line of mugs, the honey glowing on the sill like a tiny sun, and told herself the single truth she would carry to morning: she would make this kitchen live, and if she failed, it would not be for lack of heart. She believed herself. Dawn found Clara measuring cornmeal with calm precision. She sifted flour, pinched salt, and warmed buttermilk beside the waking stove. Sage waited in her palm. Leaves she had dried months earlier. Honey stood near the pane, amber and thick. Outside, the wind worried the posts. By late morning, the storm looked honed to a blade. Sky pewter. Wind carving waves across the yard. When a sleek black sleigh slid to a stop before the porch. 2 gray horses blew steam. Silver bells chimed thinly. The woman who stepped down did not wait for a hand. Sable cuffs. High collar. Beauty with a cold edge. Margaret Lyle returned like winter's envoy. Elias came from the corral with his hat in his hand. He stopped a few paces from her and spoke without hurry. Margaret. Elias. Her gaze swept the buildings, then settled on him with an old practiced claim. So this is what you chose instead of sense. Clara stood in the cookhouse doorway with a towel she kept folding to steady her fingers. Heat pressed at her back. Snow-stung air pricked her cheeks. She had heard plenty in Dusty Hollow about Margaret, the dressmaker's marvel, the banker's favorite. But the living woman carried more finality than rumor. Margaret turned and let one glance run across Clara, like a blade drawn for inspection. "And who is that?" she asked. Not to learn but to be heard. Her smile had no warmth. The cow in the kitchen, Cal at the woodpile, gave a short foolish chuckle. One of the younger hands copied it. The word struck hard because it had been aimed well. Clara felt the familiar heat flood her face, tasted iron, set the towel down with care, slipped past the pantry, and stepped out the back door into the white. The draw lay hushed under scrub pines. Wind combed her hair, breath burned until the pain steadied. She pressed her palm to cold bark and tried to let the insult blow through, but it lodged where long practice had failed to grow armor. The kitchen's neat mugs, the sponge she had fed, the honey warming on the sill, suddenly those belonged to someone the world liked better. Boot steps creaked on crust behind her. "I should have answered," she said. "You left a room that wanted sport." Elias said. He took a place beside her, not crowding, not blocking wind, simply present. Snow salted his hair, his lashes glittered before the crystals melted. "That is not a fault." "She called me a thing," Clara said. "She told a lie," he answered. "I'll say so where it was thrown." He paused. "If you want to leave, I'll rig a sled when the wind breaks. Choice is yours." The offer steadied more than any defense. "I don't want to run," she said. "I also don't want to shatter." "You won't," he said. Certainty earned by winters and work rather than flattery. "Come back." They crossed the drift together, leaving two lines the wind tried to erase. Men had gathered at the rail, drawn by bells and trouble. Margaret stood with furs perfect and chin high, the kind of posture that turns places into stages and people into props. Elias faced her. "You will not speak that way about my cook," he said. He did not raise his voice. Margaret's smile tightened. "Your cook?" She made two words sound like a carpenter's mistake. "You once preferred women who fit carriages, rooms and expectations. Have these men forgotten what a woman should be?" Silence reached down like frost. The scarred roper stared at ice. The boy who blinked at onions looked sick. Clara stood in the doorway, refusing to shrink. The stove hummed behind her. A living animal, that owed no debt to anyone's opinion. "What a woman should be," Elias said, "is what she decides. What a hand should do is eat, ride, mend and hold his tongue when he cannot hold a thought." He did not look at Cal, yet the freckled man shifted anyway. Margaret tilted her head as if already bored. "I came to see if you had sense left. I see you do not." "You came to test whether you still held my rope," Elias said. "You don't." He settled his hat on his head, not armor so much as punctuation. "The road is closing. Go while it still lets you." She turned toward the sleigh, then pivoted to cast one last look meant to plant rot for later. Clara did not receive it. She stepped into the heat and lifted the kettle as bells chimed and runners scraped. The sleigh dwindling into white. Conversation resumed in a lower key. The older rider moved the water bucket near the stove without being asked, saving steps. The boy fetched the coal scuttle and stacked wood in sizes. The scarred roper pressed his palm to the door and said, to no one in particular, hinge catching, then went for a nail and a bar of soap to ease the screw. Small corrections, nearly invisible, altered the room. Elias came to the threshold. "If town is what you want, say it and I'll make it happen when the wind drops," he said. The look in his eyes asked her not to go, but she respected any answer. Clara folded a towel over hot handles. Shame had not vanished. It thinned and cooled until she could set it aside while doing work that kept men upright. "I stay," she said. "Good," he said. He stepped back into the snow as if he trusted fire to hold and the woman tending it to do what she always did. Supper did not wait for pride. She built onion broth with a chip of marrow and a breath of vinegar to brighten it, then measured cornmeal, sifted flour, pinched salt and stirred buttermilk until batter fell from the spoon in a broad ribbon. She folded sage last so the heat would lift its clean note. Honey loosened. A drop of vinegar prepared the glaze. The storm thickened. Fences blurred. The lane disappeared between breaths. Inside the stove breathed steadily. At the first bell, men filed in, hats low, voices quieted by weather and by what they had heard. Plates went out heavy and came back bare. The boy grinned when she slid his square into broth to soften it. The older rider accepted willow bark tea for his wrist without words, which counted as thanks. Cal drifted near the tin and waited, face blank. She set a second square on his plate and did not smile. He nodded once as if agreeing with a private correction. Elias ate last as he always did. When she placed a piece in his palm, his fingers brushed hers. The touch was simple and necessary, yet sent a quick, clean wire of feeling through her. He did not remark on it. He ate at the far end and let the quiet feed everyone else. When dishes rose in stacks, he stayed to help, as if more weight suited him. Steam smoked the panes and blurred the snow, then cleared and showed it again. Their hands met over iron, pressed for a heartbeat, parted. He aligned pans by size until the lips matched, then set the tower where it would dry fastest. No speech was made, nothing grand happened, yet something in the room's balance changed because two people kept doing the same useful thing. Outside snow thickened. Inside bread rose and steadied heart. The blizzard drew a white curtain across the day, until the ranch shrank to a few shapes. Cookhouse, bunkhouse, corral, the bell rope thudding like a slow heart. Wind found every seam. Morning rose thin and colorless, yet the cookhouse glowed. Clara woke to the slow tick of iron, flexed sore fingers, and breathed mingled scents of cornmeal, coffee and onion. After days of harsh weather and harsher tempers, something in the air felt looser, as if flame had argued with despair and won. She set the dough to rise, skimmed broth, rubbed fat into flour and listened to the wind rasp along the eaves like a saw. Footsteps paused on the porch instead of barging through, a small new courtesy that registered like warmth. The first gift arrived at daybreak. The scarred roper entered early with his hat pressed against his chest, and laid a carved ladle on the table. The handle held a shallow whorl, initials cut small. From a cottonwood limb by the south bend, he murmured, ears reddening. Won't splinter. Clara turned the piece, tracing the grain as though feeling a river run beneath her thumb. It's fine work, she said, meaning. He hooked his hat on the peg nearest the stove and left lighter than he had arrived. By noon a sprig of pine lay beside the honey jar, green defying the white world outside. The boy who blinked at the onion had set it there without announcement. She tucked it between two mugs so warmth would lift its scent each time steam rose. Cal stacked wood without being told, and pretended not to see her watching him align the pile by length. The window patch held. The hinge no longer complained. The cookhouse began to move like a steady animal that knew its work and wanted to keep it. Through it all, Clara cooked. Porridge for weak stomachs, meat seared then bathed in broth until tender, sage folded into batter so each slice released a clean note. Men ate in long draughts of silence broken only by work talk. The older rider's wrist pained him less with willow bark, so he poured coffee for others like a maitre d' who had never heard the title. Cups returned clean. Spoons clean. The stove breathed like a broad chest, even and calm, a sound that eased the room. Elias moved in and out, part of the house without claiming space, most visible where work asked. He tightened a loose latch, reset a leaning shelf, and whisked snow from the sill with quick stroke. Quiet habit, never show unless needed, always know where weight belongs suited him. After the second bell he returned from the barn with a parcel wrapped in oilskin. Meltwater spotted his cuffs. He set the bundle on the cleared end of the table and waited while she washed and dried her hand. This was my mother's, he said. She'd want you to have this. He untied the strings and opened a small leather journal, edges darkened by years. Inside lay neat measures in a careful hand, roast weights, oven signs, and the sound a crust should make when a finger taps the hollow center. A pressed violet fell from between pages, summer held captive behind winter. Are you sure? She asked. You have made this room the difference between endurance and living, he answered. She wrote for a table like that. She carried the book as if it might speak. Recipes lifted off the paper and settled among her own like birds joining a flock. She penciled conversions for the flour she had, the eggs she could spare, and the temper of her stove. When she looked up, she found Elias still there, watching not with hunger but with a craftsman's interest. Respect opened a door inside her chest that the cold had kept closed. She placed the journal near the ladle and the pine, a small altar to usefulness and care. Late afternoon brought a mishap. A flour sack split along a hidden seam while she dragged it to the table, and a white cloud burst upward, drifting like spun milk. She stood blinking through powder, hair ghosted, lashes sugared. Elias stepped in at once, hands raised for the fall. Another puff swallowed his face. He laughed before he could help it, not mockery but the clean note of surprise. She tried to bury her smile, failed, and laughed too. Cal opened the door, saw snow inside, and quietly shut it again. They wiped boards and brushed sleeves, still smiling like people who had watched weather play harmless for once. The roper fetched twine and a needle. Together they stitched the seam and set the sack on a plank to keep damp from creeping up. For an instant the cookhouse felt less like a workplace and more like a home where mishaps tilt into stories told later beside coffee. Clara slid the journal away from stray dust and thought how accidents, handled kindly, can knead strangers into allies. Evening pushed light away early. Paths vanished under new drifts. Riders set lines, shoveled the porch, and tied flags at waist height so a man could find the door when night went white. Inside, bread climbed, and a beef shank murmured in a Dutch oven with onion, clove, and a slip of dried apple. The gifts kept arriving, never grand, all chosen with care. A square nail bent into a hook, a small tin polished to a mirror, a handful of dried berries that had somehow kept their color. Yet doubt did not vanish. Shame rarely evaporates. It recedes and waits. Whispers still happened beyond the doorway when backs turned and knives flashed in wash water. A look, a mutter, a hand miming a wider waist, small cuts trying to reopen older ones. Sometimes Clara's chest tightened until motion slowed, and breath turned thin. When that happened she went methodical, 3 deep breaths, count steps, check flame, clear drain, retie apron, carry on. Dignity can be built from little bricks laid one honest act at a time. Elias's gestures met those moments at angles that robbed them of force. He never grandstanded. Outcomes simply appeared with his quiet touch. A warm scarf showed up on her peg, thick wool the color of fog, ends darned with even stitches. He never mentioned it. She wore it next dawn and felt protected along that strip of neck where the wind aims its butt. When snow leaked under the sill, rawhide already filled the gap and tallow sealed the seam. When coffee thinned, a fresh tin waited beside the grinder. Between bells, work braided them together in quiet way. He stayed to split kindling to the length her stove liked, stooped to rehang a pot rail so its hooks sat level, and carried buckets without clatter. She learned his rhythm, the way he checked a latch twice, the habit of laying tools in a straight line, the pause before he spoke when anger tried to rise. Once a kettle sang too hard. He lifted it with bare fingers and cursed softly, then laughed at himself when she pressed a wet cloth to his palm. Flowers still dusted the floorboards from the earlier spill. They traced faint footprints through it, 2 trails that kept crossing, erasing and rewriting each other as the evening wore on. Supper drew an unplanned hush. Cornbread glistened where she brushed on honey. Beans tasted of smoke and clove. The beef came apart under the spoons. No one delivered a speech, yet hands carried plates back with care, as if respecting a right. The older rider poured for the boy and tapped his cup once on the table like a blessing. Cal mended a tear in the oilcloth without being asked. The roper hung his scarf near hers in a line that looked almost domestic. The room moved inside a kinder weather. At closing Elias lingered while she stacked pans. Their fingers met along a rim, and held a fraction longer than needed. Neither looked away. The space between them felt like a path laid across deep snow that 2 people could travel only by keeping step. He lifted the last pot, she dried the lip, and they set it where it belonged. When he turned to go he paused and left a stub of pencil beside the journal, as if to say, write what you learn, the table will listen. She banked the coals and stood in the doorway, scarf warm at her throat, breath blooming white in the draught. Winter kept its grip, blocking roads and sapping hope in men who depended on horizons. Yet the kitchen kept its vow, bread rose, broth restored, a ledger of small gifts gathered in corners that had been bare. Acceptance grew like a slow thaw under deep snow, unseen, undeniable. Clara lay down behind the pantry door and listened to the stove hum, sleep coming easier than before. Outside, the wind hammered and howled. Before her eyes shut, she told herself two truths. She had not been mistaken about her worth, and care had not outlived its use. Hope answered by loosening something that had been clenched for years. She dreamed of a table set for more than survival, a room that asked little and gave back plenty, and a man whose presence left warmth wherever he walked without needing to speak of it. Morning would come cold again and work would start anew, but the ranch's mood had changed, and her heart, wary, brave, awake, had changed with it. Dawn came thin and bright, and with it a wrong silence. No jokes by the woodpile. No boots racing the bell. Clara lifted the lid on yesterday's broth and heard only the stove's slow breath. Then a cough tore through the bunkhouse, rasping and wet. Another followed. A bucket was knocked over. Someone retched. Elias strode in, snow in his beard, jaw set. "Something's hit them," he said. "Fever, cramps, weakness." He dropped a burlap sack. "New salt pork from town." He sniffed, grimaced. "Off." By noon half the hands were down. The roper lay with his wrist across his brow, sweat slicking the scar along his jaw. The boy who blinked at the onion shivered so hard his teeth clicked. Cal sat hunched, gray with pain. Clara swallowed fear and tied on her apron. She boiled water until the room turned to fog. Bones went into the pot with onion, bay and peppercorns. She skimmed froth and salted lightly, letting the broth run clear. She brewed willow bark for aches, mint for stomachs, yarrow for fever, and steeped rose hips to coax appetite. Elias's mother's journal lay open beside the roper's carved ladle. A note in the margin read, "Thin broths often, never force." Clara set a rhythm to match it. Elias rigged lines between buildings, a hand to each shoulder he passed, eyes counting men and minutes. He checked the pump, hauled wood, beat a path flat for whoever had to reach the privy fast. When cramps took a man, he lifted him without boasting later. The cookhouse held anyone who could crawl to warmth. Those who couldn't made do with heated stones wrapped in cloth. Clara moved a steady loop. Fire, kettle, cup, bunk, breath. Repeat. Steam collapsed the loose strands of her hair. Flour dust turned to paste along her cuffs. She spooned broth to the roper's lips, and waited for his swallow before offering more. She set a cool cloth on the boy's neck and told him a small story about bees that love sage flowers. She added a pinch of charcoal to coffee for the few whose bellies could take it. She tasted each pot until her tongue quit noticing anything but heat. Hours lost their edge. Men slept, woke, groaned, slept again. Outside, wind worried the eaves. Inside, pots ticked and cloths warmed on rails. Elias brought news in small pieces. The south fence still stood. A mare had foaled and lived. The road was closed, but the sky showed a higher light. His voice steadied more than the facts. Near dusk, Clara's legs trembled. She hid it by stirring embers, miscounted the breaths she used to keep pace, then stood into a sway that passed. She carried a tray to Cal. He pushed her hand away, pride fighting need. "Save it," he muttered. "For the boys." She set the cup down anyway and met his stare until stubbornness blinked. He drank and nodded, the smallest apology he could manage. Night gathered. She changed clothes, lifted her head and checked the weakest twice as often. When the boy's fever spiked, she bathed his wrists with snowmelt and mint until his jaw unclenched. She set hot stones near her feet and rotated them out when they cooled. Elias worked near the door, sleeves rolled, moving with the care of a man repairing a clock in a storm. After midnight, she poured the last willow tea and forgot to set the kettle back. It clanged on the stove lip. The sound rang through her bones like a bell. She stepped backward to steady herself and felt the world drop out. The floor tilted. The glow narrowed. The stove's hum retreated down a tunnel. She reached for the table and missed. Darkness folded her in. Lamplight brought her back. Blankets tucked to her chin. The room had softened to a quieter chorus. Elias sat on a stool, hands stained, shirt open at the throat. Her face felt cool. Her hair lay combed beneath a scarf she didn't remember tying. "You fell," he said, voice low. "After you fed 8 men who swore they weren't hungry." He lifted a cup. "Drink. Ginger, lemon and honey." The first swallow broke something tight. She didn't cry, no time, but a tremor moved through her, honest as light. "I can keep going," she murmured. "I know," he said. "Not alone." She glanced at the table. Rough tallies covered a cloth, ounces of broth drunk, minutes between fevers, names beside herbs that soothed. His handwriting skidded, steadied, then held. I learned your measures, he said, a touch of rueful pride. Your notes help more than that book. He laid his palm over hers where it rested on the blanket. Heat met heat. Not fever but recognition. You are the ranch's heart, he said. The words landing like fresh wood stacked where they belong. I'll protect that. The vow carried no flourish. Only fact. They stayed while the stove exhaled and the lamp ticked. He pulled the blanket higher, and moved to Cal's bunk to turn a pillow and coax 2 more swallows. She slept a span without dreams. Morning broke clearer. The worst had peaked and begun to ebb. Men still coughed but the coughs loosened. She rose before he could protest, drank what he handed her and went to the stove. They worked as if paired for years. He skimmed while she salted, he ground bark while she poured, each step anticipating the other like a learned dance. By midday the roper asked for real coffee, voice dry but eyes alive. The boy followed broth with a corner of cornbread dipped until it melted. Cal apologized by action. He hauled the ashpan outside and cleaned the grate. When he returned he said, "Don't waste that ginger on me, give it to the kid." She gave him a full cup anyway. He didn't argue. The day wore on with fewer groans and more talk. Elias stepped outside and came back with a line of melt along his sleeve where a drift had begun to slump. "Sun's working," he said. Icicles cracked once, twice, shedding clear pieces that flashed on the porch rail. Wet darkened the path edges. Hope is often that small. Clara felt the shift inside and out. Doubt her old tenant, still rented a room, but its trunk sat packed. Strength took a seat at the table, not loud, simply present. She ladled broth with a steady wrist and found her breath matching the stove's rhythm again. Each hand she fed gave back a different thanks. A nod, a cleaned cup, a lifted bucket, a dozed smile that belonged to a boy almost mended. Near dusk, she found Elias resetting the line between buildings. She carried 2 mugs. They stood framed by a sky breaking from pewter to bruised violet. Snow along the fence softened. A mare nickered. He took his mug and brushed her knuckles with his thumb, unthinking. Then still, she didn't pull away. The touch felt like a promise spoken in a language the body learns before the mind agrees. "Rest tonight," he said. "That's an order." She almost teased him for pretending to be in command in her kitchen, then nodded. "Only if you do." He tipped his head, a smile hidden in the motion. They went back inside, where warmth welcomed them without question. By full dark the ranch sounded like itself again. Men slept with blankets kicked aside. The lamp burned steadily. The stove. Clara set the last pot in the far back and stretched her fingers until the ache released. Elias took the stool by her cot and did not ask permission when he took her hand. She let him hold it. Between them lay the journal, the ladle and a future neither knew. Outside a soft drip marked the start of thaw, each bead of water a quiet bell. Inside promises rooted. Their hands rested, steady in the quiet. Hope held like banked coals. Near spring came as a hush before it turned into a song. Drifts shrank, fences rose from the white, and water stitched bright seams along the ruts to Thornton's reach. The yard changed with the season's nerve. Rails repaired, hinges quiet, a fresh frame lifting beside the porch. Clara stood in the doorway with flour dusting her wrists while Elias planed a beam smooth enough to take a hand in passing. The men worked with an ease that hadn't lived here in winter. Cal stacked cut boards by length. The roper whistled between his teeth. The boy who once blinked at onions ferried pails without slosh. Inside, bread rose under a damp cloth. Outside, birds tried courage on the rail. By planting time a flower-draped awning shaded a newly opened wall. Elias had sanded the counter until it gleamed like softened oak. A crate from town brought enamel plates, a brass bell, and a small stack of cards printed in plain brave letters. Clara's Hearth. She traced the C, felt a flicker of fear and let resolve answer doors open for a reason. The first noon she tied on an apron that Cal produced from a flour barrel. His ears reddened while she lifted it free. Cream cloth stout seams, and across the bib stitched in steady blue keeper of warmth. The letters leaned a little, the K jaunty, the W proud. The roper had carved a heart on the wooden button and sanded it silk smooth. Clara's throat tightened. She set the apron over her dress and smoothed the bib as if laying a promise where all could see it. Word traveled the way scent runs when windows open. Teamsters stopped between loads, eating in grateful quiet before the road called. A school teacher rode 3 miles with 2 children, kissing her fingers at the first spoonful of stew. An old trapper asked if the honey brushed on cornbread came from the creek grove and nodded when she said yes, as though a private guess had been confirmed. Riders dusted pale with distance left with shoulders lowered, as if hunger had been more than stomach. Clara chalked the day's fare in tidy script. Sage cornbread with a thin honey glaze, bean soup brightened with vinegar, beef slow-cooked with onion and clove, hand pies filled with potato and leek. She poured chicory for those who preferred bitter and kept lemon water ready for travelers who had been thirsty too long. The room found a sound unlike the bunkhouse, low, warm, threaded with the soft music of spoons and reasonable talk. She moved through it with calm hands, placing, ladling, noticing. A man who flinched at onions got thinner slices. A woman with jaw pain received softer crusts. A boy who stared hard at bread and then away found his square dipped in broth before he could ask. Small mercies took root. The ranch's name began to mean more than cattle and clean fences. Folks started calling the cut from town the Hearth Road. A tinsmith traded bright ladles on lean days. A widow sent a jar of cherries with a note for tarts when the men do something worth cheering. A sawyer left a narrow bench so elders could sit while boots came off. Nothing grand, everything human, the kind of currency that keeps a place alive. Elias arrived nightly after last light, tied his horse, washed up and took his station at the base. He stacked plates by size, laid cloths where they would dry fastest, and whisked drops from the counter with the heel of his palm. When the line dwindled, he stepped outside and returned with valley flowers, paintbrush, lupine, one bold columbine tucked in his fist like small flags of good weather. He lifted a stem to her ear with deft fingers, the gesture so unhurried it felt like a habit learned long ago and finally remembered. Their laughter came quietly, shared in the steam, especially the evening a flour sack split along a hidden seam and sent a white cloud over both of them. He laughed first, not at her but with the harmless surprise of it. She laughed next, the sound clean as a bell. Ever found a place where you belong? Clara did, stay with her story. Travelers brought news as they brought hunger. A church roof mended. A foal born strong. A patch of road washed out, then was packed again by 20 hands with shovels and stubbornness. With each tale the valley felt smaller in a kind way, stitched by errands and meals. Men who had once smirked now held the door for mothers. Cal learned to pour without slosh. The roper, wrist mended, started carving ladles for anyone who needed one. Initials neat as stitches. Folks began saying the ranch had a kitchen that kept winter from winning. Between bells, Clara wrote. A small notebook lived under the counter, pages ruled like feel. She tracked costs and portions, sketched broth variations, listed valley herbs by month, and copied favorite lines from Elias's mother's journal into margins smudged by use. When the rooms settled for an hour, she wrote letters. One went to a girl named Lila, the daughter of a woman in town who had admitted her child had begun to hate mirrors. Clara made the lines gentle and honest. I was told I was too much for love and just enough for work. The world was wrong. Feed your heart as you feed your body, regular, patient, with flavor that reminds you of joy. If anyone laughs at your shape while reaching for your plate, understand whose hunger is pure. She folded the page, dabbed a crumb of honey on the seal and set it aside for the school teacher's bag. June arrived with wind smelling of cut grass and stream water. The awning's flowers thickened. The hands built an herb box where the sun would warm without burning. Clara tucked sage, thyme, mint and parsley into dark soil. The boy who once blinked at onions moved a grasshopper off the mint like a courteous landlord. Cal, uneasy with speeches, sanded a small sign that read warm bread always, and hung it where travelers could see it before they smelled. On a Sunday with clouds stacked like sheep along the ridge, Thornton's Reach hosted a dinner for anyone who could ride, walk or hobble in. Families gathered under the awning. Children slipped between barrels. The air felt like a fair stripped to good bone. Clara set everything learned into motion, staggered servings, hot plates swapped before they cooled. Low simmering broths so latecomers met comfort, and pies hid in shadow for the modest who would pretend no appetite. Elias worked beside her with wordless skill, his sleeves rolled, his movements aligned with hers as if music counted for both. As dusk lay gold along the rail, Elias carried out a small box, wood smooth to sag. He set it on the counter between the carved ladle and the pine sprig she still kept near the honey. He cleared his throat, caught himself and smiled at the habit. "I could ask for a wife," he said. Voice even, eyes steady. "But that makes your life a room off mine. I'm asking for a partner. Build this place with me. Share days, share decisions, share rest. We'll stand where we are stronger together and walk when it's right to walk." Clara dried her hands on the apron where Keeper of Warmth lay in blue, words that had begun as a gift and turned into a calling. She opened the box. A simple silver ring lay inside, hammered to a soft glow, nothing ornate, everything true. She looked up and saw a man not performing but offering what he knew he could keep. She thought of the first knock, the insult at the rail, the swale where a child cried, the long nights of steam and quiet courage. The journal passed across a scarred table and how a kitchen had gathered a valley. "Yes," she said, and the words settled the way a log rests well on steady coal. They didn't cheer, they smiled with their whole faces. The roper tapped his cup once. Cal whooped, coughed and wiped his eyes as if smoke had risen. The school teacher's children clapped until their mother laughed. Elias slid the ring on her finger and kissed her palm, a brief vow that promised more work and also more joy. Night came easily, stars scattered like salt. The bell rope hung still, inside the kitchen breathed as if it had lungs. Clara banked the fire, counted coins, tucked Lila's letter into an envelope, and set her apron on its peg. Elias turned the key only halfway so morning would open without fuss. They stood under the flowers, hands linked, listening to water and horses and crickets. The valley felt close, not small. Tomorrow we'll ask. Together they would answer. They stood on the ridge at day's end, boots set in thawing sod where winter had finally loosened its teeth. Below, Thornton's reach breathed like a creature allowed to stretch, corals drying to brown, the creek unstitched from ice. The cookhouse window throwing a warm square of light across the yard. Clara leaned into Elias's steady side, the scarf he had left on her peg wrapped high against a mild wind that still remembered teeth. She had walked a long road to this rise. A door had opened on 3 firm knocks. A cold stove had been coaxed to flame. A cruel word had been thrown like a stone, and found no lasting home. A child had cried in a whiteout and been carried to heat and breath. An illness had swept tough men and met broth, herbs and patience. All that history stood beside the present, the way an old tree shelters new growth without blocking the sun. Elias watched the valley like a steward rather than a conqueror, reading fence lines in snow melt the way a careful hand reads weather. His palm found hers, fingers strong, warmth steady. They did not talk for a while. The awning over Clara's hearth fluttered below them, and for a playful instant, looked as if the flower-drape waved hello. The bell by the door clinked once in a mild gust and fell still, as though also listening. Sunset laid molten copper along the ridge, kissed the horses' backs and set the creek to quicksilver. For a beat she saw every hard mile stacked behind this moment. Laughter falling quiet around cornbread brushed with honey, a hinge fixed without fuss, a ladle carved from cottonwood, a recipe journal offered as trust. The night she fell and woke to steady hands, the morning a whole valley made a road toward her door. "I once thought belonging was granted," she said, "given when you fit someone else's measure." "And now?" he asked, half teasing, wholly tender. "Now I know you build it," she said. "Meal by meal, word by word, hand to hand. And you guard it," he added, tipping his chin toward the creek, the barns, the town road, the small bench someone had brought so elders could sit while boots came off. He smiled at that bench, not at the idea of guarding iron or ground, but at the habit of guarding welcome. They let the words rest while the sky deepened from rose to violet, stars testing their voices one by one. Clara drew a breath that filled all the way down and out. She had fed a ranch through a storm, turned years into quiet, and taught a kitchen to sing. Yet none of that felt like a crown. It felt like work done right, shared with someone who knew how to lift without stealing the weight that gives a task meaning. They spoke of small tomorrow things as the last color fled, the pies she would start before dawn, the fence line he would ride, the new ladle the roper wanted to trade for the old so he could refine his carving. Big matters hid inside those little plans, shared ledgers, planting vows, seasons to come, but neither hurried that talk. To rush would cheapen the care that had carried them this far. Clara looked into the distance beyond the ridge, toward faces she could not see but felt, the travelers who arrive by story and sit down hungry for proof that kindness and resilience still matter. Her voice when it came was steady and warm, the voice she used when a frightened child needed calm more than sugar. If you have ever been named by someone else's smallness, she said, if you have stood in a room that tried to shrink you, hear me, you are not a mistake. You can set a table that welcomes the best in you and the best in those who come tired of hard weather. Elias squeezed her hand, a squeeze that said, I saw you, I stayed, I will keep staying. He looked toward the cookhouse, toward the town road, toward the mountains that keep their own counsel, and back to her. Say what your heart wants, he murmured. She laughed softly. My heart wants to feed strangers until they feel like neighbors, then feed them, he said, and invite the rest. She turned toward the horizon and spoke for all who had been walking with her unseen. If Clara's story stirred your heart, if it reminded you that kindness and resilience conquer all, tap that button and subscribe to Prairie Heart Tale. New stories weekly of love that outlasts storms and shame. Join us in the untamed West. Subscribe now. Silence followed, not empty but full, like a table just before the first plates land. Down below, the cookhouse lamp brightened as if on cue. The creek ran faster with the melt. The scent of damp earth rose, full of seeds and secrets. The valley inched from winter toward green, from endurance toward ease. They walked down the slope hand in hand, boots finding true ground beneath the thaw. Each step carried the weight of the road behind and the lightness of the trail ahead. At the porch, the bell shook in a friendly way, and the door opened on warmth. One day ended where another continued, supper to make, ledgers to mark, a laugh to share, a kiss to hide in steam. The sun left a last line of gold on the window and slid away. Carry this ridge with you into whatever weather waits at your door. Remember the simple arithmetic of mercy. Give more than scorn expects. Stand where truth asks. Lift what is yours to lift. Accept help when it comes, and protect the hearth that protects you. The world can be cold and loud. The answer can be warm and steady. That is love, proved by practice. So take this valley with you. The creek bright with melt. The awning moving like breath. The apron stitched with keeper of warmth. The man who carries wood without fuss. The woman who sets down fear and picks up a ladle. The sky that refuses to stop opening. Let it remind you that judgment can be outlasted, that tenderness can be learned, that resilience is a craft, and when you need a place to rest, come back to the hearth and sit. Stand with them one last moment on that ridge, and let the light finish its work. See how the thaw lines the ditches with silver, how the barns hold their shape, how the bell waits for the next good hour. Think of every time you were told to make yourself small, and remember how bread rises anyway. Think of hands that carried you when your feet failed, and hands you carry. Here worth is measured by care given and care received, not by cruel mirrors. Take that measure with you, let it change what you ask of yourself and what you offer others. Then come back for another tale, another fire, another dawn. True